Good afternoon. I have a joke for you. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Lettuce.
Lettuce who?
Lettuce, and it's cold out here. Hello, fellow Ag Geeks. My name is Mrs. Shepherdson. I'm glad to see you today. I like to start class off with a really dumb joke, and I think you might agree that one was extra silly. So, we are going to start our series about plants today, and the most realistic way to start learning about a plant is to start with the seed. Now, first you need to know that seeds have several parts to them. These are the parts of a seed. We see that the embryo is the little tiny baby plant. We know that the whole seed is surrounded by a seed coat, which is the hard part. And then finally, the bulk of the seed is filled up with endosperm. Now, endosperm is really important because it's what helps the plant grow to the top of the soil after you plant it until it can reach the sunlight. Most of you already know from science that plants photosynthesize. That means that they create their own food by soaking up sunlight, having a chemical reaction go on inside the plant, and then that sugar gives the plant fuel to grow, if you will. And as it grows up out of the soil, it lives on the endosperm until it hits the sunshine. The sunshine begins to photosynthesize. We see the plant turn green, and the plant begins growing quite well. Now, you may be wondering, how do I get this seed, and its three parts of the seed coat, embryo, and endosperm, to turn into a plant? We call that process germination. Now, plants need usually four things to germinate. The first would be water. They need the correct temperature. They need some air in the soil, and they need light. Now, not all seeds need light to germinate. Some actually need the dark, some need the light. That varies very much so on type of seed. But here's a few things you can learn just by reading the seed packet. So for example, here's a seed packet for some squash, and here's some for lettuce. On the back of both of these, you will see quite a bit of information. Now let's decode the information. The first thing it usually tells us is seed depth. That's how deep you plant it in the soil. Plant spacing means if you are planting in a garden, how far apart should those plants be? The row spacing is if you were planting rows in a field, how far apart they should be. It tells us how many days it sprouts in and how many days it matures in. Now, the date that it matures in means from the time you plant the seed to the time that you have a fruit. And then it tells you about how many seeds are in this packet. Now, every seed packet's a little different, but most of them have that information. There's this cool thing about seeds, and it relates to endosperm, and that has to do with the size. You can't even see the lettuce seeds in between my finger, and this is a squash seed. Why are they so different in size? Well, it has to do with the genetics of the plant. The important thing for you to know is the size is directly relational to how deep you should plant the crop. For example, I read on the seed packet here, and it said that the seed of this squash should be planted about 1 inch deep. That's because that seed has that much endosperm to help it get to the top. It also needs to be planted deeper so that the roots can go deeper or wider or in whatever shape they need to. Now, the lettuce seeds say 1/8 of an inch. And so really that's very, very shallow with a tiny bit of soil on top of it. Now, you'll notice that every time I plant a seed, I take the soil and I kind of pat it afterwards. A lot of people call that firming the seed bed. If the soil is not firm around your seed, then the roots won't have a stable place to go down. You don't need to press it down like a thumbtack, but you do need to kind of pat it into shape. So now we know about seed size, we know about seed type. We are going to talk about how you can actually start growing some plants on your own. Now, next lesson will be about soil, but for now we'll ignore kind of the makeup of soil and just talk about how to maybe make this work. Some of you may have some old planting containers in your garage. Feel free to use those. If you don't, another good option is an egg carton. The hard part about egg cartons is as they get watered, sometimes they kind of disintegrate, so before long you need to transplant. Whatever the case, most of the time you have better luck planting when you put the soil in and pre-moisten it, then plant the seeds to the correct depth and water it a little bit each day. Now, most seeds and plants want for the soil to dry out in between planting or in between waterings. So be careful that you don't get the soil too wet and keep it wet. Let it dry out in between, but sometimes there's a fine line between letting it drain out and dry out and letting the plant get so dry it dies. So you'll learn about that as we go. Here's an example of how you might start seeds in an egg carton piece. And here's another planting container. If you're starting them in your house, I really recommend finding an old lid or a plate or something to collect the extra water. That way you don't ruin the surface of wherever you've set your plants. Now, we said that there are 4 things that seeds need to grow. We've talked about the water. We've talked about the air, letting it drain out. Don't worry so much about the light right now, but do think about the correct temperature. And so correct temperature would mean that you need to know about what temperature your seeds like to germinate in. You could do some research and learn which crops are cool season crops and which crops are warm season crops, because that tells you the temperature they best germinate at. In a large scale greenhouse or a hobby greenhouse, sometimes they have warming mats. I use those in the school greenhouse, and that makes the summer seeds or the warm season crops germinate faster. If you don't have that, I would recommend finding a window with some full sun and letting the sun do some work for you. However, check the moisture of your seeds every day and pay close attention to not let them get too dry. Now, sometimes people plant a seed and they come back the next day and they're rather disappointed that the plant has not grown yet. Pay special attention to the back of your seed packet. Even this lettuce, it says won't germinate for about 7 days. The squash, close to 14. And so I want you to write down what date you plant them so that you know how to have some realistic expectations. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're learning. Let me know what you'd like to learn about next, and we'll see you tomorrow.